Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk.
Hello, so I'm here today with my lovely friends and colleagues, Susan and David, and the topic that we're going to be talking about today is liminality. And this is something that we've been talking about, the three of us, for quite a while, and we decided we needed to have a conversation about it. It's a really interesting concept. And I'm going to ask each of you your view of it as a thing. What do we mean by it? But for me, it's that kind of the space between. So it's the transition from what was done before to what is being done now. And then there's that bit in the middle, which is the liminal space. And it's a really amazing space to grow and to learn. But I think often in organisations, it's not something we pay enough attention to, or personally. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So Susan, I'm going to go to you first. What is your view on this as a topic and a concept, and why is it that you're interested in talking about it?
I'm fascinated by it. And I never thought about it very much until a couple of years ago. I was at a retreat in Scotland, and they had this concept, ma concept, which is a Japanese concept, which is about allowing a space between. So rather than packing the agenda full, that there's space between sessions to allow what it is you've been reflecting on or working on to settle and something new to emerge. So it's not an emptiness or a void. It's actually full of possibility. And once I started to explore it, how they explained it, I guess, or the Japanese concept is about, if you listen to music, there's always space between the notes. And then if you apply that to just a book or a page, there's always space between the words. So that space, that white space, for another way of describing it, is necessary. And from a philosophical perspective, perhaps, the transition between birth and death is the ultimate transition, and life is the space between. And then everything that flows out of that, moment to moment, between each breath, between each heartbeat, in everything we do, there's a space. And a lot of us don't like those spaces. We find them uncertain. And that's where I'm interested. And in particular, in that transitional, because that's what it is, but phase for people, perhaps leaving one job, going into another, and getting up to speed with the next one. So that's like quite a lot of transition. And then organizations, because they know they want to make a change, they want the result. But of course, the messy middle, the space between, is where the work gets done.
Wow. I think an amazing explanation. Thank you. Over to you, David. Anything to add?
Oh my God, that was awesome, Susan. Oh my God. It was interesting when you talked about the space between words. And you mentioned about people feel uncertain in that space. It makes me think of, in conversation, when people feel the need to fill up the space. And I'm remembering a friend when I first started hanging out with this guy, his tempo of speech was so slow. And I like deep conversation, but even this was like more reflective than I was used to. I'm like, is he going to say something more? Is it my turn? So that kind of like that awkwardness, and it makes, to your point about the space, it makes me think of the awkwardness and the unknown that, I think is natural for anybody, but, certain personalities have more or less comfort with the unknown and the need to like fill that space up. Um, when you asked that question, Susanne, what first came up for me is that quote that I love, is life is a mystery life is not a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be lived. And how oftentimes that liminal space is seen as a problem to be solved. Like, okay, what's the 5-step plan to get me into certainty, and being comfortable in that place of not knowing. So that's what comes up for me.
It's really interesting because I do think this idea of space is something that brings people discomfort. I think we as humans feel comfortable when we're busy, and we can tell other people that we're busy. It's something I see increasingly with people who I know. You ask someone how they are and their instant response is, "Oh, I'm so busy," and it feels a backward step to me. So I'm wondering, both of you have busy lives with work and family and everything else that you're doing. How do you create that space for yourself in your life? David, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I feel like I'm super conscious of that. Super conscious of the importance of self-care in order to function in the world. So, at the simplest level, I'm not one of those people who like get 4 hours of sleep and then they're like, it doesn't bother me. I crush it. Like I'd be in the, fetal position in the corner. So I'm very conscious of having plenty of alone time and having that space. And actually, though, I do have to admit, it's been interesting. For years after, when smartphones were, invented, for years, I avoided having a smartphone and, didn't want to become addicted to it. And did a really good job until maybe a year or two ago on listening to a lot of podcasts, which is great, but fills in some of that space. And then also getting like addicted to YouTube shorts, goat videos and dog videos and that sort of thing. And I'm like,
you and your goat videos.
Oh God. And so just like noticing how much of what used to be free space I have been filling up with just, scrolling through. And so just starting to dial that back to get more of the free space.
I think what you say is a really interesting point about noticing, isn't it? It's about having that consciousness of noticing when you start to fill that space, the space between and the space that you need with other things. Is that something that resonates with you, Susan?
And I suppose in a way you could say that we have all the space we need. We choose to fill it. So we think we need to create space, but the space is there already. And it's being discerning perhaps about what we fill our space with. And now, okay, I know that it's different if you're self-employed or going to work every day, but there's still space between leaving your house. Well, maybe not as much anymore. I think COVID had an impact on that as well, because people weren't commuting. And the commute, I think, for a lot of people is that space between. And I know so many people who used to love commuting because they were able to process on the way home in particular, to let go of the day. And you very much cross that threshold when you go into your own house. Then you're actually going from the world outside over that space between into your own home. So one of the things that I've practiced, and mainly from writing the book, was to follow my ultradian rhythm. which is to work for 90 to 120 minutes roughly, and then take a break. And an active break. So not passive, not scrolling on YouTube or Instagram or LinkedIn even, doing something active, getting out in the garden, going for a walk, whatever it is. Sometimes it's talking to somebody, sometimes it's just pausing. And I noticed now when I don't take time to pause. And that's been a big shift for me, because it took a while to get in, because we have to practice these things. We can't just decide that that's how I'm going to do it. There's practice. And space, I've always wanted space. I've always craved spaciousness, and love the outdoors impact of all of that. But what I've begun to understand is that space is here with me all the time, and I can drop into the space.
That is interesting. Last week I did a commute into London for the first time for quite a long time, and it was really interesting to me to observe people on the train and on the tube, and how nobody was just sitting. Everyone was pecking away at their phones. And I decided, I listened to music on the way down on the train, and then on the tube I just sat and just looked around and stared at people, probably in a creepy way. But it was I was the only person doing that. No one else was looking up, and that was a conscious choice for me. I just didn't want to do it, and also I was just wanting to sit and be and have a bit of a rest. I had a lot of meetings that day, and I didn't want to fill my head with anything else. But I think modern life makes it increasingly hard to find space, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, Susanne. There has to be a conscious effort to seek it out. It's there. The temptation is to fill it. And that's just, everything is competing for our attention, isn't it? Everything. But it's letting the mind wander is so important. And that, we all know, you go in the shower and you have a you have a new idea, or you go for a walk and something becomes clear. We know this intuitively, but we think we don't have time. And it's something I focus on a lot with my coaching clients, is creating or allowing that pause. And I ask people to start with a minute. If you can't find a minute in a day to just do nothing, stare out the window for a minute. And I think once you start to practice the pausing or enjoying the space between, then you begin to crave it.
Yeah, man, that is so true. So much of my adult life, I knew meditation was important, but I kept telling myself I couldn't do it. And when I would try, I'd be like, this is driving me crazy. And then I started, just like you were saying, Susan, with your clients, like just do it 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And now there are times where I'm so aware of just craving it. And like, this is just what the doctor ordered. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said, Susan, about threshold, because I don't know whether you know, but the origin of liminality is from the Latin limen, which means threshold. So yes, there's method in the madness. But that's what it is. It's the threshold from one thing to another, isn't it? And you don't realise you're there unless you create the space around it, exactly as you said, David, through meditation and through practice and creating the space.
And in Ireland, or in, might say, old Irish tradition and everything, the liminal space, or the threshold, was between this world and the next. And there are certain times of the year where that is very thin. It's a thin veil. It's a liminal space. The threshold is barely noticeable. And in particular, for the month of Samhain, November, which is, the end of October, beginning of November, then the shift from autumn to winter, and again Bealtaine, May time, again this shift from spring into summer. So those liminal spaces exist. And just recently I shared an episode with David about this. It's Irish author who sadly passed away at the age of 55. But it was very interesting. He had recorded an interview a few weeks earlier, and it was very interesting because he was talking about these liminal spaces, almost, that he always felt that he lived, somewhere between both worlds, and that he was always conscious of that. And okay, that's a foray maybe in a slightly different direction, but it's an interesting threshold or liminal space to think about. And look up at the moon. There's a whole expanse of world, and there's a beautiful full moon at the moment. And last night we went for a walk, and we went up high, and I saw this phenomenon, I would say, that I have never ever seen in my life before, where the moon was like that, and then, okay, I'm just showing a circle in the middle, and then a cloud went out around it, which was maybe a shadow or something effect, but from the two sides of this cloud were kind of like rainbow lights. So the moon was somehow, there was some effect happening. And that felt otherworldly. Like that felt like some sort of liminal space or space between. So I think there's magic. Maybe that's the thing about the Irish and the thresholds, and there's a sense of mysticism. And you talked about living life in mystery, David, and I feel like I've gone off topic slightly when we're going to talk about organizations and everything. But there's something in that unknown that allows room for anything to seem possible.
Very cool. It's sort of like this image I'm seeing is the liminal space on the horizontal plane, and then the liminal space on the vertical plane. And it actually makes me think of a little LinkedIn interaction, Susanne, you and I had related to the hero's journey.
Yes.
And when I said how I sometimes like to use the term mythic journey, so it kind of takes away the like ultra masculine alpha male kind of connotation of hero. But when you were sharing, Susan, it made me think of one of the, like, in some ways on a very practical level, what I've found over the years is in those liminal spaces and those liminal times of my life to, actively thin out the veil, if you will, between this world and the bigger cosmic spiritual world really helps navigating this. Like we're able to see it in a bigger, more mythic view versus small, hunkered down, like I don't know what to do next. In this dimension.
That's interesting. I think I'm glad you talked about the hero's journey, because I was thinking about that too, because Susanna Liller, in her writing on it from the female perspective, talks about threshold guardians, so the things that sort of help you but also stop you from moving forward. And I think it's that she always describes it as like you have various times in your life when you reach a crossroads, and you can either get help or be hindered as you move forward, and those are the threshold guardians. So I think it fits well. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking is this idea of time, and how when I did my NLP training a long time ago, we talked about how people see time inwardly. So you can either see time across, like from left to right, or from front to back, and different people see time in different ways. And if you ask them to imagine their life story, you can see from their body language which type of person they are, and where they see the time. And I wonder if there's, I don't have an answer, it's just a thought that popped in my head, but that's almost quite an interesting exercise to do with yourself and with others, to see how you see your timeline. Would it be from left to right, or would it be from front to back? Because if it's left to right, you can see it all, whereas if it's from front to back, you can't. I don't know. I have no answer to that. It was just something that popped into my head.
And with that, though, again, is there's a line, there's a start and an end, and I think that's it. You know, you are not rushing to the end, and I think we spend so much of life and work rushing to the end, rushing to the result, and we miss what's in between. And I think that's the beauty of the in-between, or the liminal, is it allows us, the empty space allows us to notice what is going on around us. If we're going meeting to meeting to meeting, that's it. If we are in a meeting and everybody takes 2 minutes to gather their thoughts, something new might arise. But it's back to what you were saying, David, about the person speaking very slowly. I think that would probably drive everyone, I could feel myself even. And that's our problem, isn't it? Because we're listening as well to get our point across, as opposed to listening to understand. If we're listening to understand, we're relaxed. We're okay with silence and the pause. We take time to formulate our answers. And I'm sure all of you will know, in a coaching session, whether you're being coached or the coach, those spaces are where change happens, where a worldview changes, because suddenly there's a new perspective. And when we don't allow space for new and different to emerge, then we keep doing what we've always been doing.
How do we create that in organisations? Because I think we know, and I think most people listening to this will know, it makes sense to give people time and space, reflection as the superpower, all of that stuff. How do we persuade people in organisations that this is something that we need to do? Because I had the same conversation earlier today when I was talking about creating human-centred change, and about, the pace you do it at, and you give people space to change at their own pace, etc., etc. And the person I was speaking to said, well, that's fine, but how do I get that into an organisation where they want to do everything yesterday? So I'm really interested in your experiences of, have you experienced organisations that are able to create that space for people, and what did they do? David, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I would say personally, I can't think of an organization that I've worked with that overtly recommends and supports that. It's so much the opposite. This is sort of cliche, but I know, at least back in the day, Google was really big was like 20% of the employees' time spent on projects, and 3M, the same sort of thing. That's where Post-it notes, the idea for that came from. But yeah, it's so the opposite.
What I found with one organization I worked with, they wanted to allot time for deep work. And in a way, I see that as something similar. But of course, their concept was that they could pile everything into that hour. And it wasn't to just sit back. And I think it comes back to what we would often talk about, David. It's the polyvagal in the nervous system. Because when we're used to being in a certain way of being, which is always on pretty much, then anything that shifts us out of that is a signal of danger. Because if we're going too fast and then we need to slow down, that's a danger signal automatically to our nervous system. So it is I think, like a lot of things that we want to shift ourselves, it's starting with baby steps. And what I found is with another organization, was just taking them outside and asking them a question and giving them time to wander around a garden, pondering the answer, and then into groups. And while I told them they had a very, 10 minutes, I knew that they were going to have a half an hour or whatever, because once they started to allow the space, then new stuff came in. So maybe that's tricking people, I don't know. but it's allowing that space between, and certainly when I design facilitating workshops and everything, I always try and allow space. And that will be a resistance often. But I think back to what I said earlier is we intuitively know this. So I think all of us intuitively know that when we have space, relax. Even if you say to somebody, take a breath now, everything's okay. There's kind of a feeling of, and once people get into that, and if they can also have a new idea or go in a new direction, then they may start to practice it more. But you can't, persuasion, we can't, can we, Susanne? All we can do is model it ourselves. I think that's it. It's about how it works for me, and it may not work like that for you, but what would you try to do?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's one of those things that you have to just do it, and a leader has to decide they're going to create the space for themselves and for their team to just have a bit more thinking time. And I guess it's also, I'm thinking back to the days when I was in an office environment a bit more, to be less judgmental if someone appears to just be sitting there looking out the window, because they might be having some of their best thinking at that moment. But back in the day, I and others probably would have thought they were daydreaming. And I think maybe it's allowing that sort of behaviour and encouraging it rather than seeing it as someone being lazy.
That actually reminds me of like pen and ink, black and white cartoon from maybe the New Yorker, the great cartoons where there's this executive, with the suit. This was like many years ago, suit and tie, staring out the window, and this other guy who I guess is his boss is saying to somebody like, how do I know if Smith is actually thinking about soap? Like it was a soap company, like Procter and Gamble or something, and not whatever else kind of thing. It's like you're hoping that the person is, ideating in productive ways. Anyway, it just flashed onto that.
That is funny. But yeah, I mean, you don't, do you, right? You just have to be okay with the fact that they might be, or they might not, but they still might have a really good idea.
Yeah, and even if, like, one of the things I'll say sometimes in seminars is even if the person is just taking a break, back to the ultradian rhythm, Susan, that you're talking about, that's a good thing. Their brain is resetting. So, yeah, not a problem.
I know we have this kind of idea, don't we, that if we work hard and stick at it, then we'll get the answer that's required. And I'm sure we've all done it. I can certainly say I've done it, and I still do it at times. And there's something so powerful about even just stepping away from the desk, even having that break of just moving. Changing what you're looking at in your environment, all of it starts different neural pathways firing, and you just never know when that space you created will result in the answer that you were looking for. And I think the thing about this is, that phrase, slow down to speed.
I was just going to say that it's slow. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast is another version of that in the special forces. Yeah.
And I think that slowing down, it's not about slowing down in the outside world even. It's about slowing down what's happening inside, the thinking and the the focus, and we can only do that, I believe, when our minds are rested and we feel restored. It's very hard to direct your attention fully to something when you're underslept or you're hungry, or all of those, very basic things that we have as humans. And that's why we even have like meal times. There's space between, aren't they? All of this is space for us, and yet we decide, oh no, I'm going to work through and eat at my desk.
Al desco, eating al desco. Very bad.
No, it's fine. I've never heard that. That's great. As you're saying that, Susanne, what popped into my mind was some of the cool work. I don't remember the author's name, but the book is, I think, Open Focused Mind. I think that's the title. And this guy has some sort of like health center where they compared brain function with either a very like ultra focused meditative, like your breathing, a mantra, etc., versus a more diffuse focus. So kind of like unfocused, where you're aware of like the space between the top of your head and your belly button, so it's very diffuse. And what he talked about, and then all sorts of physical and mental health benefits from that. What he talked about, which makes total sense when you think about the brain, is when we do a more diffuse level of consciousness, so we're no longer furrowed brow trying to come up with the answer, but it's just like enjoying the beautiful scenery in that more web-like, holistic, right brain, gestalt way of thinking. Yeah, then we've got the divergent thinking, the connecting the dots, the creativity. So, just the creative value of not grinding it out.
Yeah, very true. Very, very true. And I think you've both talked about being outside. And I think that's a key part of it, isn't it? Is changing the environment. And I wondered whether you felt there was something about the seasons here as well, because Susan, you've already alluded to the sort of different spaces. But I was reading about Lammas, which is the field, when the field's been harvested. This was a traditional festival on like the 1st of August. And it was the kind of midpoint between summer solstice and the autumn equinox, and it was the space between the light and the darkness where they would celebrate the gathering of the harvest and what had been accomplished, but also look forward to the future. And I wonder, when I read that, I didn't know any of that till I read it. It popped up on something I was reading a couple of months ago. I'd become disconnected from that cycle. And it got me thinking, from what you were saying too, whether that's something we as individuals need to reconnect with, but also in organisations, are there opportunities for organisations to reconnect with that cycle? So as well as people's own rhythm, it's the rhythm of the year. I don't know. Have you? I've never experienced that in an organisation, but it'd be interesting to know if any do connect in that way.
What comes to mind, and might be for both of you really fun guests for your podcast, is Kevin Hancock's work. So he was the CEO of Hancock Lumber, or maybe still is the CEO. No, he's the chairman of the board. I think he's the 5th or 6th generation in the family of this lumber company in Maine. And he, a bunch of years ago, right during one of the big, I think it was the 2008, 2009 like explosion, implosion, whatever, of all the markets and economies. And so the building industry obviously collapsed right when that was happening. So that huge challenge in his company, he ended up having, was it spasmodic something dysphonia? It's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has.
Oh, gosh.
So he when he first got it, he couldn't even talk. And so he had to delegate because he couldn't say anything. And then he went on a bunch of pilgrimages to various Native American reservations, and was mentored by various Native American elders. And his book, The Seventh Power, tells that story. It's unbelievable.
Oh, wow.
And the term seventh power is based on American indigenous peoples, their spiritual model. But he would be somebody who, since he is so tapped into indigenous communities and wisdom, it'd be interesting what he would have to say about that.
Yeah, it's not something that I'm familiar with really, other than reading a bit of folklore and things like that. But it is fascinating, and I feel like we've lost something as a species, that we've become more apart from that way of living.
I think in a way, I think of it in the financial aspect, where we work towards a quarterly plan. We do annual budgeting. So I think the concept of seasonality as such is there. However, it's just become part of the working environment as opposed to what it was really for, maybe originally. That time, take some time to sit down and think about the plans for next year. Now it's just like last year's plans plus 2% or whatever. So there was that, and then review every quarter how we've gotten on, what's going ahead, taking holidays. I think things were much more in line with the seasons, but the Industrial Revolution and time being time carded and all of these things kind of got rid of a lot of that as well, perhaps. From a people perspective, still, I think you have August in this part of the world, and certainly in Europe, where everything shuts down more or less. And again, December to January, it's hard to get people. They're away, they're taking time off, they're with their families. A lot of people talk about the beginning of September as being like the beginning of a year as well. So I do think the ideas are there with people, and organizations probably have some of that energy. It's not perhaps consciously part of their design, though.
I'm wondering, David, is it the same in the US? Is August like a quiet month, or less so?
Very much so. And where I live, it's very much a vacation destination. So it's very, playtime oriented. Also, in terms of, like, what do we do with this understanding of seasonality? That one of the things that's been really helpful for me, learned years ago from a mentor who's very, steeped in indigenous, traditions, et cetera, and it's kind of a extension to the following your ultradian rhythm, is instead of fighting the seasonal shifts in energy and focus, like, be more aligned with nature. And so, like, in the winter, do that like pulling inward, etc. And then, when spring comes and you feel that surge of energy, like, ride that horse, as long as you can, kind of thing.
I think, most of us, definitely, the winter is like hibernation, isn't it? In the evenings, you don't want to do so much because it's dark. Whereas in the summer, you finish work and actually you feel like going out for a walk or whatever because it's lighter. So I think it's good for us to tune into that and how that impacts on our own rhythm of living. The other thing that struck me about this view, like the seasons, is around endings and beginnings. And I think that's something that I come back to over and over again with my own work in change, that so many organizations are focusing on beginnings all the time that they don't do enough about endings. So if you're asking people to do something different, a new system, a new piece of technology or a new way of working, you have to give them space to process what's gone and what's been lost. And I think it's a concept that organizations struggle with sometimes because there's that constant forward momentum. But I see that as part of this too, that you have to have a well managed ending. Then you can go into like the liminal space and then you can move forward with something else. But you have to have an ending before you can do that with energy. The William Bridges is the model of change that I really like. And he always talks about once you have a well-managed ending, you can move forward with energy. And I think that's quite a nice way of putting it.
And I feel that's very important when somebody hands in their notice, Susanne, and that period between handing in their notice and actually walking out the door, which can be anything from a couple of weeks to 6 months. And it can be detrimental to everyone involved. And I've rarely come across an organization that has managed, or individuals within an organization really, that can manage that transition, that ending. The tendency is to forget about the person and move on and almost blame them for leaving and badmouth them and do whatever. And then, oh, what, you're still here? What are you doing still here? But not letting them go either. And I often see that as being a very poorly managed. And what you said, Susanne, about the energy, can you imagine because you bring someone in and you're like, oh, welcome, so glad you joined us. And again, then you often let them falter, like you do everything to recruit them and then you let them go. But can you imagine if you managed those transitions, support people to start well, but also to end well? That would reverberate through an organization, and celebrating the person, what they did while they were there. But of course, you had to get rid of them. That's a whole different.
Yeah, it's funny we said if you had to, because when you say the transition between putting the notice and they leave, sometimes it's 15 minutes, go get your stuff in your box and leave.
And even that can be handled with grace.
Yeah.
I remember when I went off on maternity leave that it was like the biggest letdown ever, because I was going off to do one of the greatest changes of my life. And I remember I got some presents and they did a kind of little speech, and then everyone went back to work and I was just like sitting at my desk thinking, all right, what shall I do now? I didn't have any work to do, of course, because I wasn't going to be there for a year. So I remember I just walked out of the office and went home, and I was devastated, because for me it was a huge deal, but of course for everyone else it was just like, oh well, she's gone, off we go. And then when I went back, I had a year off, I walked back in and it was like I'd never been away, and the whole thing just felt really disappointing.
The human experience isn't, these are the things that we think we don't give air to and we don't give space to.
Yes.
But they're so important and they make such a difference to the energy within an organization.
I think on projects it's really important as well. I see it all the time on change projects where there's no space to unpick what's been gone before. So I worked on a technology implementation earlier this year, and I don't know whether I've told you this story before, but it's quite funny that I was going out speaking to different stakeholders, and they kept talking about the last time they'd implemented this piece of technology, and it was about 10 years before. and people kept talking about this Project Pearl, and it was terrible. It was the worst thing that ever happened to us. So I started asking questions, and then my client kept pulling me to one side and going, Susanne, stop asking about that. You're just raking things up from the past. And I said, but we need to know, because this is clearly something that wasn't finished off properly for people, and they're still carrying it with them into this project, and it's making them be cynical and fatigued and, oh, here we go again. We've got to get this out. And anyway, I persuaded them to let me do a workshop where I just said to people, just come and tell me everything that happened on Project Pearl, and we'll learn lessons from it this time. And people just came and vented at me for about 2 hours, and I took notes and everything. And at the end, people said, oh, I feel so much better. I feel like I can put that aside. And then we were able to say, all these things you told us about that project and what went wrong, we're building that into how we're doing this project. And it was a classic case of no one had ever finished that off. It was just still running and running and running, and then carried forward into this new project, which for people who weren't working on it felt the same, because it's the same technology, but of course it wasn't. But you have to end stuff, otherwise it never finishes. Sorry, David, you carry on.
No, good stuff. And actually, just one quick comment related to that. One of the things that I remember hearing somebody say at a workshop, when I don't know what the exercise was, just let's say do's and don'ts of a leader. And one of the things this person said, how that we never pause to celebrate when we finish a project. It's just, all right, let's move on.
Yep, onwards.
Onwards. Tally ho. So another part of the, slow down enough to savor, hey, we did this kind of thing. When Susanne, you're talking about the underwhelming response to your leaving and then coming, it made me think again about, another facet of slowing down and pausing is that's also where thoughtfulness and empathy can spring forth. If we're always, hyper focused on our goals and everything, we're not pausing to think about Susanne going off in this amazing thing, and isn't it great to see her back, and want to make sure she feels welcomed, etc. So another reason for doing the pausing.
I remember to the project thing, I remember implementing a new finance system in an organization I was working in, and various countries were rolling it out at different times. And I was in the Kenya office at the time, and they were running the old system and the new system in parallel for months, but not telling anyone because they didn't know how to let it go. They were afraid the new one wouldn't work, and just that kind of risk averseness. And I remember the financial controller telling me, like it was yesterday, that the old system was on life support. And, it was just on life support in the background. And I was like, right, well, I'm here to pull the plug.
No heroic measures.
We're ready to let go, But there was that sense of an ending. And if I hadn't asked, perhaps, they might have run those two systems forever. That safety, again, that we crave, that certainty. And what came to mind when you spoke, Susanne, and when you spoke, David, was never-ending story. That we can get caught in a never-ending story without knowing it unless there's an ending. And that's the beauty of a story. When we were always told in school, it is a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, and the problem is that, and you will have seen this too, if no one ever breaks that process through allowing people to talk about it and taking a bit of a break, these stories just carry on and on and on. And I've worked in a lot of organisations, as I'm sure you have, where people are telling stories about things that happened when they weren't even there. because they've heard about it, and it becomes part of the kind of the lore, the mythology of the organization. And often those stories are not particularly helpful. It doesn't support the culture now, it doesn't support the organization now, but it becomes part of it because no one's ever challenged it or asked a question or created a process where that can finish and people can move forward with energy. And I think organizations are so bad at doing this because there's that constant forward momentum, dysfunctional momentum often, in that it's moving in the wrong direction. I think it's about celebrating, like you said, David, what's been achieved and then closing it and then moving forward. And I think we all need to get better at doing that.
Yeah, because we look to blame as well, don't we? And we look at the negatives always rather than the what did we learn from this? Even if it was a disaster, we still learned something from it. Let's start from there.
I think also a common thread with let's not open Pandora's box and allow them to be talking about how much they hated Project Pearl, as well as I want to get out of this liminal state ASAP, so I'm just going to take the first job or whatever the create some certainty. Is I love how James Hollis, the Jungian analyst, talks about anxiety management systems. And so you think about in the workplace, most people have not the greatest emotional management skills. And so, like, if I'm a manager, I'm a senior leader, like, I don't know how to deal with all this vitriol, so just like shut it down. And then I'll feel better because I don't have to deal with it. Or again, if I'm in this liminal place, that feels super anxious. So let's just come up with a solution and be done with it. It's like the research on premature cognitive commitment. It's the more anxious a person is, the more likely they are to jump to a conclusion.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
The brain is just like, it's gone into tunnel vision, isn't it? Probably.
Well, and you just think of people's general personalities. The more self-efficacy a person has, the more confident, the more they are able to embrace not knowing. But the more insecure a person is, they always have to be right, always have to have an answer. Yeah.
I heard, I was at on a course, and this author, Stephen D'Souza, I think he's a management consultant as well or something, but he talked about, for him, he always wanted to know, the certainty and everything. And there was something about a house move happening, and it was just all up in the air. And the estate agent said to him, "Can you be with not knowing?" And he's written a book since called Not Knowing, as well as other books. But in that talk that he did, he talked about Keats, the poet, and this concept of negative capability. And it's like letting go of the need for a logical explanation. And I think that's where our rational one, and that's where we get caught up a lot of the time. We want the explanation, or we want to show that we know, because saying I don't know is back to being in this liminal space, isn't it? But the power of saying I don't know is it takes us into the liminal space where the knowing can emerge. And so many of us spend our lives pretending to know or making it up on the spot so that we don't seem like we don't know. But we live in a world where it's complex, and complexity requires dancing with the unknown or in the unknown.
Yeah, I wish leaders were more comfortable with being in that space, because I think it creates so many problems in organizations for moving forward with stuff that doesn't make sense, but also an unwillingness to stand up on stage and be honest about the fact that they don't know, they haven't got all the answers. I remember someone telling me a story once about a leader. We were talking about the most effective leader that they'd ever worked with, and they worked for a big public sector organisation in the UK, and they'd had a whole series of very kind of heroic leaders who, you know, knew everything and were, you know, charisma, full of charisma and all that sort of thing. And somebody new joined, and they did a town hall meeting where they invited questions. And this was new because previously all the questions had to be agreed in advance so the person could know the answer. I know, yawn. But this new person said, just ask me anything you want. And the story that this guy told me was someone asked this new leader a question, and the leader said, I don't know. I've only been here a week. I don't know the answer to that, but leave it with me and I'll get back to you. And he took the person's name, and within a couple of days, he'd contacted the question asker personally and said, right, I've looked into this for you and this is the answer. And this person I was speaking to told me this story is the greatest example of leadership they've ever seen.
I love
because it was
it.
different.
So simple.
Yeah. It makes me think of this cool story that Peter Bregman tells. So, you know, written a couple books, executive coach. And one of the things he said I loved was it's so interesting to him how all the qualities that the typical leader thinks makes them look strong are the ones that make them look weak, and vice versa. And then he shared this real kind of his version of your person's story, where he was working with a leadership team and they were dealing with some really thorny problem. And the CEO of the firm is in front of the group, and she looks out at them, and she almost like throws something in frustration, but not at them, and says something like, I don't have the answer. Like, I don't know what we should do. I need you to help me figure this out. And it was cool because Peter said, when she said that, he said, like, I didn't feel like, oh my God, we're screwed. Like, she has no clue. It was like, sweet, we really matter. Let's roll up our sleeves and work, you know, figure this out. And if only more leaders would realize that.
Yeah, I think that the model of leadership, and it's back to what we were saying, David, about the hero's journey, is why that is so problematic for people, because it does present the leader as hero, and actually that's not what we need. We don't need heroic leaders. We need the leaders who are prepared to lean into the unknown and the unknowable. So I really liked when you were saying about the mythical story. For me, that's a far better way of describing it, and I shall call it that from now on forever.
Well, and actually you're saying before that, and thank you, liking the mythic journey, I'm just flashing on to this book that, God, I think it came out in the 70s by Dr. Ellen Langer, the Harvard psychologist, called Mindfulness. And this was before, you know, way before mindfulness was like a big thing in Western society. And do you see the dog in the background open the door?
Yeah, she's just been knocking at the door. Let me out.
That was awesome. I love that. Seeing that recognition on your face. And she shared a study which showed that managers who got the most, I think it was creative ideas and maybe engagement too, and this is before engagement was a term, were the ones who had confident uncertainty. And so they didn't pretend to have the answers. They were very straightforward in saying, I don't know the answer. And they were confident that they and the team would find it. So confident uncertainty.
I love that.
Isn't that cool? Yeah.
I love that. I wish more leaders had that. We need to be encouraging this in our leadership teams that we work with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing I find often with the leaders that I coach is the control. People want to feel in control, and to feel in control, they then believe they need to know everything. And of course, when they kind of realize you can't ever know everything, and they know that at a certain level, there's a relaxing into that. But there is that, everybody's looking to me. I have to know everything, and therefore I have to control everything, because if something creeps in that I'm not in control of, then I might not know it. And that's like a whirlpool, isn't it, that keeps you in.
And I think going back to our earlier conversations about technology, I think we are now operating in a world where you can know things. I always tell my daughter about, what it used to be like when you had to do some homework and you had to go to the library to look it up in an encyclopedia. And I remember when I was at primary school, in Victorian times, when I was at primary school, we were given 10 things we had to find out every week, and as our homework. It was great homework, but you had to have an encyclopedia or go to the library and look it up. And if you couldn't find it, then you just didn't know, and you had to be okay with not knowing, because there was no way of finding out. And she finds this concept really weird, that we just had to be okay with that. We just had to go, oh, I don't know, and I'm never going to know, because there's no one I can ask. And of course, now with Google and AI and everything else, we do know everything. We can find out everything. And I wonder if that's made it harder for us and leaders to admit that they don't know, because some problems are really thorny and don't have an easy answer.
And we can't know the future.
No.
AI, no matter how good it is not telling us the future. The future is unknown. Always. No matter the budget we set or the plans we have, it's unknown. And perhaps that's the place to start with people, because they can't know what's going to happen next. And even I suppose for most of us, when we plant a seed of doubt like that into our beliefs, it opens up the space between what we thought we knew and, what we're now going to know. And that's what I would always tend to look at, is the future is not known. Even if you set a plan in place, a perfect plan, it's out of date the minute it's done. It was a plan.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect place to finish our conversation, that we've had a very wide-ranging conversation as ever, and let's finish on the unknown. But I'm interested, before we finish, in both of your thoughts on, for you, what's been interesting for you from this conversation, and what would you like the listener to take away from it? So Susan, over to you first.
We normally do book recommendations.
I know.
But I have a book to recommend.
Hey.
And it's a children's book called The In-Between Book. And funnily enough, I went to get off my shelf Dr. Seuss's Oh, the Places You'll Go, because the waiting room that he talks about for me is the liminal space, and I was going to, and of course, this was on the shelf beside it. And I thought, this is the perfect book. So what I got from this conversation, I loved this conversation. I think that might be obvious, because I've been leaning into the screen even. And what I love is making connections with things that I hadn't necessarily thought about before. So both of you, I've made some notes, both of you brought points in that I maybe hadn't thought about like that before. And maybe what I would like the challenge to the listener is, rather than thinking, how do I create space between, it's looking at the things that I don't need in the space and not filling them. Then take them away, don't fill them. There's your space between. Because not everything we do every day is necessary. The space is there. You don't need to go and try, because that creates stress in itself. rejig things or look at what you're doing already and get rid of the ones that aren't going to make a difference.
Very nice. Thank you. And thank you for the book recommendation. Always like a children's book recommendation. There's a lot of wisdom in those books, that's for sure. David, what about you?
I guess what comes up to me, and I just called it up on the screen, speaking of Google, because I couldn't remember the whole quote, is the Rilke quote. And I'll read the beginning and the ending of it. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So learning to love the question and not just the answer.
Fabulous. Thank you, David. And what a great way to end our conversation. As ever, it's been brilliant talking to both of you. Thank you for the book recommendations to add to my already heaving pile of books to read, and for the stimulation. There's lots here for all of us to think about, but for the listener as well. So thank you both very much.
And you, Susanne, did you have a final thought?
I have a thing. So it's not a book, it's a thing. So it's my my Tending to Endings cards, which I know I've spoken to you about before. But this is it's a deck of 12 cards, which has been designed to enrich our relationship with life's endings. So I was asked to be part of the beta testing team for this particular product. So I'm not sure it's there in the market yet. These are prototypes, but they're wonderful. So we're talking about nature. So I'm showing them on the screen now, but there's a series of cards. They all have kind of themes around nature. So you've got fallowing, you've got mulching, you've got compost, and they're designed to stimulate thinking around endings, so how we can do endings better. And I love them. They're so beautiful, but also I think they do stimulate that thinking. So here, for example, fallowing is the one I'm looking at now. So it's described as a way of giving the earth time to recuperate. When demands on productivity become too high, fallowing offers a pause and a chance to restore vitality. And then the quote that they have on this one is, I create a deliberate pause to ensure long-term vitality. So these are my things. I love them, and I've been using them a lot in my facilitation and coaching. So instead of a book, I have a thing. Hopefully they'll be available on the market very soon. From the autumn, they say. General release from the autumn 2025.
Brilliant.
But I was very lucky to be invited to test them. I've also been invited to test a type of executive fidget toy, which I'm very excited about, because anyone who knows me will know I have an obsession with pressing buttons and switches. So it's a wooden thing with loads of different types of buttons and switches. So maybe we can have a further conversation when that arrives for me to test, and I can test it with you.
That's awesome.
I can't be trusted around machinery with buttons and switches, because I just want to press them. And if it says do not touch, it makes me more likely to want to touch it. I can't explain it. It's a weird thing of my brain. Anyway, thank you again for a stimulating discussion as usual. And as ever, it's been a joy to share a bit of time with you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation, and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.